Okay, let's get started. All right, so May, June 2017. There we go. Okay, question one. Use the following goods market model to illustrate and explain by using a chain of events or words how taxation can be used during an economic recession to increase the level of output and income to reach the full employment level. Clearly indicate any shift or movement on the diagram below. Okay, so firstly, a couple of things that you need to know out of the question here. You can use your chain of events. Rather use your chain of events. It's a lot quicker, so it will save you guys time in the exam. We want, or rather we are in an economic recession and we want to increase the level of output and income. So you know that would be a decrease in a taxation or increase in government expenditure to reach the full employment level, which is indicated as YF. Okay. Clearly indicate any shift or movement of the diagram. Firstly, you need to know that this would be an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so it's not a change in the tax rate, it's a change in tax. Okay, so when they use change in tax or capital T, you actually shift your goods market model, or rather you shift your demand curve. If it was a change in the tax rate, you would pivot the curve. Okay, so in this case, they want us to reach the full employment level of income. We're going to decrease the tax rate, and when we decrease the tax, and when we decrease tax, we will pivot the curve upwards to ZZ1. All right, so what I was saying there is it's a decrease in tax, but rather put an upward arrow to show that there is an upward movement of the demand curve. Okay. Obviously, correspondingly, when we shift the demand curve upwards, there is an increase in output and income, which you need to also show on your graph. All right, so the chain of events, in this case, we dealt with a decrease in taxation. So tax decreased. If you decrease your tax, it increases your disposable income. If people have more money to spend on goods and services, that's exactly what they're going to do. Consumption will increase. As consumption increases, demand for goods and services will increase. Output and income will increase. Okay. Everybody understand how that works? If they had instead said that there was a change in the tax rate, okay, you could say that it would be a decrease in the tax rate. And the decrease in the tax rate would pivot the curve upwards. Okay. So it depends what they ask you for. But in this case, obviously, change in tax, we shift the curve. All right. If they say a change in the tax rate, okay, tax rate, we pivot the curve. Right, now, to calculate your change in output and income with a certain change in tax, okay, the change in output and income is equal to your MPC. All right, remember MPC, they might give you MPC or small c, it means the same thing, multiplied by the change in tax, multiplied by the multiplier. Okay. That's obviously just extra information. You wouldn't have to include that for this question. I'm just explaining it. Okay. If you have any questions, just stop me and ask me straight away, please. All right, question 1.2. Use the following diagram to explain why a decrease in the money supply will lead to an increase in the equilibrium interest rates. Okay, so this is your money market or your financial market. Now in this case, they've actually given you the graph, but they might not give you the graph. So they might have just given you the question, use the following space provided below to draw a graph to show how a decrease in the money supply will lead to an increase in the interest rate. You need to know that you need to draw your money market when they ask you that question. So change in government expenditure, taxation, investment, autonomous consumption, induced consumption, all of that, you would draw your goods market model, the previous graph. Money supply, money demand, you'll draw your financial market, this graph. Okay. All right, so we can see what happens there. When the money supply is decreased from MS to MS1, we can see that there is a corresponding increase in the interest rate. The only thing they're really asking us here is for an explanation why. Okay. So firstly, why is the money supply exogenous? We assume that it's exogenous because it is determined outside of the model. Okay. The SARB determines money supply. It is completely independent in this model. Okay. Now, what they do is they use open market operations Now, what open market operations are, okay? If the South African Reserve Bank wants to decrease the money supply, they will sell financial instruments into the economy, all right? So they'll say, here, take these financial instruments, please give us all of this money in return, okay? The financial instruments, which you can think of as pretty much just a piece of paper, would be held by whoever buys them, commercial banks, and in return, they would give a whole bunch of money to the SARB. That money would exit our economy, and the money supply would decrease. Okay, so that's essentially what the open market operations are. The chain of events to describe that, okay, the money supply is decreasing, but then how does it actually affect the interest rate? If the money supply decreases, the demand for bonds decreases, the price of bonds decreases, and therefore interest rate increases. You need to remember your relationships, okay? And one of the relationships is price of bonds and the interest rate, and they are negatively related. One increases, the other decreases, okay? All right, so if the SARB is selling bonds or financial instruments, the price of those instruments will decrease and drive up the interest rate. The Fon D Lm Curve. Now, this is obviously from your ISLM model. Remember, we derived the IS curve using the goods market. We derived the LM curve using the money market. Okay, so LM, liquidity money. Right, and this curve shows combinations of income and interest rates, where money demand is equal to money supply. Remember, because we derive the LM curve from the money market, okay, we use different equilibrium points to derive the LM curve. So essentially, any point along the LM curve, the money market is in equilibrium. All right. And money market equilibrium, as we saw in the previous graph, was where your money demand curve intersected or was equal to your money supply. All right. If they had asked you for the IS curve, derived from the goods market model, any point along the IS curve, the goods market is in equilibrium. All right. Define the aggregate demand curve, or the AD curve. Now, the AD curve is in our ADAS model, aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. All right. So the AD curve, or you can call it aggregate demand, shows the total quantity of goods and services demanded at different price levels. Right, so what does any demand curve show us? It shows us the quantity demanded of a good for each and every different price that we get. Okay? Downward sloping because of the law of demand. Right? If the price of a product increases, quantity demanded decreases. If the price decreases, quantity demanded increases. There is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Or, in this case, in the aggregate demand, price and aggregate output and income. Okay. But it means the same thing. Aggregate output or quantity, same thing. Any questions? Illustrate using 3 different diagrams below and explain by using a chain of events the difference between the impact of a contractionary fiscal policy on the following models. What is a contractionary fiscal policy? Contractionary, the economy will contract after this policy or during this policy. Government expenditure decrease and or a taxation increase. Okay. So the first one on your goods market model. Now they haven't actually given you your start point. What you need to do is before you get into the exam, you need to learn all the different graphs. There's not too many of them. You need to learn the start points. Okay, so what things to include, you need to label all your axes, you need to label the curves, and from your spot, you'll at least get a couple of marks for your start point, and then they'll give you obviously a change to the graph. Okay, so in this case, goods market model, remember you got your 45-degree line, you've got aggregate demand on your y-axis, you've got aggregate output and income on your x-axis. On your 45-degree line, those 2 axes are equal to each other. Demand is equal to supply. Okay? Then you've got your demand curve. You can call it your ZZ curve. And you've got your equilibrium. Let's call it Y0. Alright, so that is your goods market model. It always looks exactly the same. That is your start point on your goods market model. The next one they want is your ISLM model. Okay? Your ISLM model, obviously you've got your IS curve derived from the goods market. You've got your LM curve derived from your financial market. LM curve, positively sloping. IS curve, negatively sloping. You've got aggregate output and income on your x-axis, and you've got interest rate on your y-axis. Start with I0 and Y0. In this case, you've labeled all your axes, you've labeled your curves, and you've got your initial equilibrium points. Okay? And then finally, for your ADAS graph, it looks exactly the same as your normal demand and supply graph. Right? You've got a positively sloping aggregate supply curve, a negatively sloping aggregate demand curve. You've got price level on your y-axis, and you've got output and income on your x-axis. Again, P0 and Y0. So like I say, learn these off by heart so you get into the exam and you can at least draw them, at least you've got your start point. Okay. Now, what they want us to do is show the effect of contractionary fiscal policy on all of these graphs. Right? So starting with our goods market model, change in government expenditure. In our goods market model, government expenditure is exogenous. We shift the graph. We shift the curve. Because it's a decrease, we shift it downwards. Decrease in government expenditure will decrease aggregate output and income. We shift it down to ZZ1. Change in government expenditure, decrease, and your new equilibrium point at Y1. And then draw in your arrow to show which way your equilibrium output and income is moving. In this case, obviously from Y0 to Y1, and we can see that obviously Y0 is greater than Y1. Okay, it is decreasing. All right, for your chain of events, okay, the goods market chain of events, there's two chains of events that we can use here. We can use, obviously, the increase in taxation or the decrease in government expenditure, okay? So we've already done the taxation chain of events, but I'll just do it again. Increase in tax, in this case, would decrease your disposable income, decrease consumption, decrease demand, and decrease your equilibrium output and income. If you were to use government expenditure, which is what we did in our goods market model, a little bit more straightforward. Decrease in government expenditure decreases demand for goods and services, decreases output and income. All right. Now, for your ISLM and your ADAS graph, there's a little bit more involved, okay? You need to remember when they give you a fiscal policy change to your ISLM model, you've got 3 points that you're going to have to draw on the graph, okay? Obviously, your first equilibrium point, an intermediate point, and then your second equilibrium point. If they give you a change to LM curve, if they use a monetary policy change and you shift your LM curve, there's only 2 points. Your initial equilibrium and then the new equilibrium. All right. So, and for your ISLM, whatever the change is, if they give you monetary or fiscal policy, you're going to have to include your chain of events from both markets, from the goods market and from the financial market. Okay. So in this case, because they're talking about a contractionary fiscal policy, that's your goods market, you know you derive your IS curve using your goods market, therefore you're going to shift your IS curve. Decrease in government expenditure shifts the IS curve to the left, okay? Shift your IS curve to the left. Indicate with an arrow which way it is moving, okay? Now, in your goods market model, there is no interest rate, okay? Interest rate is in your financial market, which is why we have the 3 points when we shift our IS curve. Okay, so I'm going to give you the chain of events as we make the changes. So flip over to the chain of events. What we just did was a goods market model shift, all right? So we start with a goods market. We've assumed a decrease in government expenditure, which decreases income and therefore consumption, decreases demand, decreases output and income. All right, now, if you look back at your graph, that indicates the difference between Y0 and Y1, okay? But we are still at an interest rate of I0 because there's no interest rate in our goods market model. So if you had to label these points, this would be point A, that would be point B, okay? And you can actually show that in your explanation, Y0 to Y1. But we can see that we will not settle at that point because obviously that's not an equilibrium point in our goods market model, right? Remember, equilibrium point is only when the two curves intersect, right? So basically what we need to do is explain why there is a decrease in the interest rate from I0 to I1. And for this, we need our financial market. All right, so we go to our financial market. If there is a decrease in output and income, what does that do to money demand? Money demand decreases, all right, and it will decrease interest rates. Remember, on our financial market, if we've got an equilibrium interest rate, if income decreases, income is an exogenous variable in our money market. So if income decreases, we shift the graph, and therefore we would decrease our interest rates. So now we've explained why there is a decrease in the interest rate. Okay? But that is not where we're going to stop, because what happens when you decrease the interest rate? We are actually going to increase the output and income, which means we need to go back to the goods market model to explain why output increases from Y1 to Y2. Back to your goods market. Right? The decrease in interest rates would affect investment spending. There is an inverse relationship between interest rate and investment spending. So when an interest rate decreases, it stimulates investment spending, which would increase demand for goods and services, and therefore increase output and income. And this is the change from Y1 to Y2. And that is our new equilibrium point at point C on our graph. No, the short and long run, or short and medium run, is in your ADAS graph. Don't think about that for your ISLM. Okay. All right. Everybody cool with that? Then the third one, they want us to show the decrease in government expenditure on the ADAS graph. Now, what you need to remember when you're dealing with your ADAS graph is that fiscal policy and monetary policy are what we call demand management policies. They will shift the AD curve, only the AD curve. Okay. So, decrease in government expenditure, we shift the AD curve to the left. Okay. If there is a decrease in price from P0 to P1 and a decrease in output from Y0 to Y1. Now, in your ADAS graph, we differentiate between the short run and the medium run, or the short run and the long run. So if they ask you medium or long run, it means the same thing in the exam. Okay? When you shift only the AD curve, this is your short run. Okay, like I said, it's from one of the policies. Fiscal or monetary policy would shift the AD curve. What you need to remember for your ADAS graph is that your economy will always return to the equilibrium, the natural equilibrium. Okay, so actually, instead of calling it Y0, call it YN. Okay? Now, that is your natural rate of output and income. Okay? If they ask you for the long run, your AS curve always shifts in response to a change in your AD curve, and the AS curve will always shift in such a way that it will return your economy towards the long run natural rate of output and income. Okay. So if, as we've done in this case, we decrease aggregate demand, we know we're going to increase aggregate supply to return us to the natural rate. If, on the other hand, we had given an increase in aggregate demand, in the long run, the aggregate supply curve would shift to the left to reduce output and income back to the natural rate. Okay. So let's first run over this, and then we will shift the AS curve. Okay. Now, I think this is going further than you would need to. All right. I think for this question, you could stop for the short run, but I'm going to shift the AS curve as well, just to give you some extra example for the long run. Okay. So this is your short run. And obviously, we're going to start with our fiscal policy, because it was a government expenditure change. It was a fiscal policy change. Government expenditure decreases, aggregate demand would decrease from AD1 to AD2. All right. Actually, sorry, insert between there, income decreases. Yeah. All right, then. In your goods market, right, how would we show this in our goods market model? Remember, we would shift the graph down. We've seen in graph number 1. Goods market, government expenditure decreases demand for goods and services, which would decrease output and income. All right. So what we've done here is we've shown why there is a decrease in output from yn to y1. Okay. However, obviously there is also a change in price level. All right. Now there's no prices in goods market, so we need something else to try explain why there is a change in price. Okay. So to do that, we need to incorporate the financial market as well. All right. With the financial market, because there is a decrease in output and income, it will decrease the demand for money. And if we decrease the demand for money, we decrease the interest rates. In your labor market, decrease in output and income decreases your employment. Employment is shown as capital N, which obviously correspondingly increases your unemployment, shown as small u. Now, remember in your labor market from chapter 8, you talk about the bargaining power of laborers when there is a change in unemployment. Inversely related. Increase in unemployment decreases the bargaining power of workers, which means they can't bargain for higher nominal wages, or they might even get lower wages. All right? So increased unemployment causes a decrease in the nominal wage. And then also from your labor market, remember how prices were determined. Prices were determined by firms as a markup over their cost of production. And we assumed that the only cost of production in the labor market was labor. So if the price of labor decreases, the prices of products will decrease, because the price of products is only a percentage above whatever it costs us to produce those products. So if, for example, markup is 20%, we're currently paying workers 100 Rand, price of the product will be 120 Rand. Okay. If the price of labor decreases by 50%, price of the product will decrease by 50%. Price of labor decreases to 50 times 20%, we'd sell the product for 60. Okay. So what I'm saying there is, because there is a nominal wage decrease, it will decrease the price of products. So now we've shown both the decrease in output and income as well as the decrease in prices. I assume this is where you would have to stop for this question. But again, I'm just going to take you one step further so you can see if they do ask you for the long run. If they only asked you for the short run, this is where you would stop. Okay. In the long run, they might not call it long run, they might call it medium run. Medium run, long run, same thing. Okay. You always work in the reverse. So you saw, because it was a fiscal policy change, we started with the goods market, then the financial, then the labor market. For the long run, you work in the reverse. Labor market, financial, and goods market. Okay. So what happens when there is a decrease in the prices, wages, unemployment increases, etc.? We start with the labor market. Now we assume that workers base their wage negotiations on expected price level. Okay. So if the current prices are decreasing, we assume that workers expect future prices to be lower. Okay. So price expectations are decreasing because of the decrease in price. But it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So they bargain for lower nominal wages and therefore actually decrease the price of products. Remember, we assume that workers only want to hold a real purchasing power. Okay? So they don't care whether they're getting paid 1,000 Rand a month or 1,000,000 Rand a month. They only care what they can actually buy with 1,000 Rand or 1,000,000 Rand. Okay. If they expect prices of products to decrease, they bargain for lower nominal wages. Obviously, this is a theoretical concept. They bargain for lower nominal wages, and therefore the prices of products, because prices again are just a markup over wages, prices will decrease. Okay. All right. Then we work backwards to the financial market and the goods market. You can just do them in one go. Financial market and goods market. If you've got a price decrease, your real money will increase. decreasing your interest rate, increasing investment spending, increasing demand for goods and services, and finally your output and income. And all of this is shown as an increase in the aggregate supply. And we would shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Yeah. Monetary policy change, you start with financial market, goods market, labor market, goods and financial market. Right, so to show this effect on our ADAS graph, it would be an increase in the aggregate supply, which shifted to the right. Do you see how there is a further decrease in prices, which we proved via our chain of events? And we said that there would be an increase in output and income, and you can see that we would return the economy by the shift in the AS curve to our natural rate of output and income. Okay. Any questions? All right, the next question. Given the following information, answer the following questions. We've got the domestic interest rate in South Africa, 3%. Domestic interest rate in the US of 5%. If you expect the rand to appreciate by 5% in a year's time, would you buy South African bonds or American bonds? Okay, so let me explain how this works quickly. You're going to invest now. Okay, let's assume you're investing for 1 year. You're going to invest at time and you're going to cash out at time plus 1. All right. If you were to invest in South Africa, straightforward. You're investing in South Africa, you get the return that they are promising you for the 1 year. You get 3%, you get 3%. That's it. When you invest overseas, there is 2 elements that affect your return on investment. Both the interest rate, okay, as well as the exchange rate. So think about it. If you were investing in America, what you would do is you would sell your rands today and you would buy dollars today. Okay? Let's assume that the current exchange rate is 10 rand to the dollar. So what you're going to do is you're going to sell your 100 rand and you're going to buy $10. Okay. You're going to invest your $10 at time now. All right? You're going to invest it for the entire period. So let's assume that there is a 5% return or 10% return. 10% return, at the end of the year, what have you got? $10 plus 10% of $10, $1 return, you're going to have $11. Okay? But at the end of the time period, you're going to pull back your dollars from America to South Africa. In this case, you're going to have to sell your $11 at a current exchange rate. So if you assume that the rand will appreciate during the year, okay, from, for example, 10 rand to the dollar, all the way to 20 rand to the dollar, sorry, 5 rand to the dollar, appreciate. Okay? It costs less in rand terms to buy a dollar, which means if you go backwards, if you're selling dollars and buying rands, you're going to get less rands for your dollar. So at the end of the time period, you're going to sell your $11 and you're going to buy rands. Now the exchange rate is only 5 rand to the dollar, so you can only afford to buy 11 times 5, 55 rand. Okay. So do you see how the exchange rate affected your investment? Does this make sense? Okay, so back to the question. If you expect the rand exchange rate to appreciate by 5%, it means you are losing money when you are selling your dollars and buying rands back at the end of the time period. Okay? So to compare your two investments, If you invest in South Africa, straightforward. Return in SA is 3%. Okay? Your return in America is 5%. On face value, you're going to invest in America, but they've told you that the rand will appreciate during that time period, which means that when you swap it back, you're going to get 5% less. So because it's an appreciation, you need to subtract your 5% that you're going to lose when you convert your dollars back into rands. Okay? Which means that you will actually get a 0 return in the US. Therefore, invest in SA. Now, this might not be the case in the question. They might actually say in the question that the rand depreciates against the dollar during your investment period, which means that at the end of the investment period, when you're swapping your dollars into rands, you are actually going to get more rands per dollar than it cost you when you invested. And in that case, if they assume that the rand depreciated, let's say by 5%, you would have got 5% return in the US, and then you would have to add your 5% additional return because the rand depreciated, which means 10%. And in that case, you would definitely invest in the US. Okay. Does that make sense? Oh, which is exactly what the next question is. Okay. So question B, if you expect the rand dollar to exchange rate to depreciate by 1% in a year's time, what should you do? So in that case, your return in South Africa would be still your 3%, and your return in the US would be your 5% that you get, plus the 1% depreciation in South Africa, which means a 6% return. Invest in US. All right. Yeah, for question B, you're comparing the 6% and 3%, yeah. So you would definitely invest in the US. All right. Question 3, study the diagrams below. Given the equilibrium level, in the goods market, there is a corresponding trade balance position in the different diagrams. Okay, so this is where we talk about our net exports, right? Now, where your exports are equal to your imports, firstly, well, that is what net exports is. Net exports is exports minus imports. Net exports, exports minus imports. Now, when your net exports value equals 0, okay, that would obviously be where your exports are equal to your imports. You are dealing with what we call a trade balance. And we can see that in this case, where our net exports curve is at Y0, at 0, trade balance. Okay. For graph B, we can see that at a value of Y0, it is a negative value. Negative trade deficit. Okay? And for graph C, we can see that it corresponds to a positive value which means trade surplus. So that's the first part of the question. Diagram A illustrates a trade balance. Diagram B, a trade deficit. And diagram C, a trade surplus. Now, what they are asking here, this model is called the goods market in an open economy. Remember the difference between an open and closed? Closed economy, we do not trade with foreign countries. Open economy, we do trade with foreign countries. If they ask you to draw the goods market for an open economy, this is what you need to draw. This is your start point, okay? And they will specify, or they might not, but they will probably specify whether your goods market equilibrium corresponds to either a trade balance, a trade deficit, or a trade surplus. So you need to know how to draw all three of those scenarios. That would be your start point. Okay, then they're going to obviously give you a change to that graph. Now, question B, use diagram A below to illustrate an increase in exports on the level of output and income and the trade balance. Clearly indicate any shift and or movement on the diagram without changing the equilibrium position and the trade balance position. Okay? So it always boils down to one of two. It is a change in foreign demand or it is a change in local demand. If it is a change in foreign demand, you will shift your net exports curve. So a change in the exchange rate will change foreign demand. Change in foreign income, change foreign demand. Anything that stimulates exports, or rather changes exports, will shift the net exports curve. If there is a change in local demand, okay, so if they say income in South Africa increases, now remember we've got marginal propensity to import. So if our income increases, we're going to import more goods and services. We will not shift the net exports curve, we move along the net exports curve. Okay. So the first question is obviously said, diagram A to illustrate an increase in exports. Now, an increase in exports, you should already know, shifts the net exports curve to the right. Okay? So, on our goods market diagram, to show an increase in exports, you would shift your demand curve upwards by changing exports. If we've got an increased demand for our goods and services via an increase in exports, it means it will drive up the production of our goods and services. So we are going to produce more goods and services. Our income and output will increase, okay? From Y0 to Y1. Easiest way to do this, just drop your dotted line down to the net exports graph. What they've specified is that there is no change in the trade balance, okay? Which means that we need to shift our net exports curve in such a way that the balance is still a trade balance, okay? So we still intersect at 0, okay? In diagram B, they've asked you to show the effect of a depreciation on the exchange rate. If the rand depreciates, what's going to happen? Our goods and services are going to become more competitive on the international market. So Jimmy, the American, will swap less dollars for the same amount of rands, or he will swap the same amount of dollars for more rands. Our goods are more cheap, or our goods are cheaper, so he will buy more products from us. It will stimulate our exports. We know change in foreign demand, we shift the net exports curve. Okay? And again, I think they said without changing the equilibrium position of the trade balance. So Exports will increase. We will have increased output and income from Y0 to Y1. The net exports curve will shift to the right in X1, and we can see that we still have a negative trade balance or a trade deficit at that point. All right, in diagram C, the question reads, use diagram C to illustrate a decrease in government spending on the level of output and income and the trade balance. Clearly indicate any shift or movement on the diagram with, again, out changing the equilibrium position. So what will a change in government expenditure do? Government will decrease their expenditure, okay, which means that income in our country will decrease, and therefore the demand for goods and services will decrease, okay? If the demand for goods and services is decreasing, we will shift the ZZ curve downwards, all right? And that is due to a change in government expenditure, decreasing the output and income from Y0 to Y1. And what will that do to our trade balance? It will increase our trade surplus. We do not shift the graph, we move from point A to point B along the graph. So originally we intersected the net exports curve at point A. Now because it's above zero, it means obviously that exports were greater than imports. We had a trade surplus. But now, because people are earning less income in South Africa, we are importing less goods and services, but exports are not determined by our government expenditure. They're determined by foreign government expenditure. Foreign income has remained the same, so their imports remain the same, which means our exports remain the same. So if our exports remain the same, but our imports decrease, it will improve our trade balance. We're exporting the same, we're importing less, which means we move from point A to point B, and we move further up the positive axis, meaning our trade surplus improves. Okay. Questions? Okay, question 4. Draw an ISLM model for an open economy in the space below. Indicate what will happen to nominal exchange rate if a contractionary monetary policy is applied. Explain the impacts on output and income and on the trade balance using chain of events. Okay, so first thing you need to remember is if they ask you to draw an ISLM model for an open economy, you always draw two graphs. Okay, you draw the ISLM and then you draw your interest parity relation. Okay, so start with your ISLM. On your y-axis, you've got interest rate. On your x-axis, you've got output and income. Positively sloping LM curve, negatively sloping IS curve. Equilibrium interest rate I0, equilibrium output and income Y0. To the right of that graph, you always got to set them out exactly the same. You've got your interest parity relation with interest rates on your y-axis and nominal exchange rate on your x-axis. Okay? Your interest parity relation is a positively sloping curve, interest parity relation. And what you do is you just extend your dotted line from your interest rate to your interest parity relation, and you've got a corresponding nominal exchange rate and interest rate. So that is your start point. Okay. Now what they've asked you to do is show the effect of a contractionary monetary policy. We use the money market to derive the LM curve. So monetary policy will affect the LM curve. Contractionary monetary policy, we shift the LM curve to the left. When we shift the LM curve to the left, we have a corresponding decrease in output and income from Y0 to Y1, an increasing interest rate from I0 to I1, and to show the effect on our nominal exchange rate, we use our interest parity relation to show that there will be an increase in our nominal exchange rate. Your chain of events, start with your financial market. All right, so what we need to show is why interest rate changes, why output and income changes, and why your nominal exchange rate changes. So we start obviously with our financial market because that's where we have our monetary policy. Money supply decreases, real money decreases, which increases the interest rate. So we've explained why there is an increase in interest rates. The next thing, we're going to use our goods market. Now when there is an increase in interest rates, what happens to investment spending? Investment spending will decrease, negative relationship between those two variables. If there is a decrease in investment spending, there is a decrease in the demand for goods and services, and therefore the production of goods and services. Output and income will decrease. So now we've shown both why there is an increase in interest rate as well as a decrease in the output and income. The last thing we need to do is show why there is an increase in our nominal exchange rate. To do that, you use your interest parity relation. An increase in interest rates increases your nominal exchange rates. If your nominal exchange rate increases, your currency appreciates. What will that do to exports and imports? It will decrease our exports, it will increase our imports, and therefore it will deteriorate our net exports. It will deteriorate our trade balance. So the theory behind why these two are positively related, okay? Remember back to our question where we had the return in South Africa and the US, okay? If there was a higher return in the US market, what you would do is you would sell your rands, you would buy dollars, and you'd invest in the US. So you would be driving up the supply of rands on the international exchange, and you'd be driving up the demand for dollars on the international exchange. Currency, like any other commodity, increase in demand, increase in price. Okay? Price increase of that currency is an appreciation. Okay. So in this case, obviously, it would be the reverse. There was an increase in our interest rate, which means the return on investment in South Africa increased relative to the rest of the world. So they would sell dollars on the international exchange, buy rands, drive up the supply of their currency, drive up the demand for rands, which, because the demand for rands increases, the price of rands increases, and the price of rands is your nominal exchange rate. The rand will appreciate. Okay. You obviously don't have to give all of that explanation for this question. Any questions on that one? Right, question 5. This is your labor market. Intersection points between the price setting curve and the wage setting curve is called the natural rate of unemployment. Define the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so natural rate of unemployment is the rate of unemployment such that the targeted real wage implied by wage setting is equal to the real wage implied by price setting. All right, so in your labor market, you've got obviously your wage setting relation where workers would bargain for nominal wages, and you've got your price setting relation, which is from the firm's point of view, which is with our markup, right, or their markup. Okay. So you need to know what factors would shift both of those curves. Okay. Name one wage setting factor and one price setting factor that will cause a decrease in the natural rate of unemployment. Clearly indicate the change and the direction of the change. Okay. So for your wage setting factor, anything other than the unemployment rate would shift the wage setting curve. If they tell you that the unemployment rate changes, you move along the wage setting curve. But if they give you any other factor that would affect your unemployment, remember there was bargaining power caused by minimum wages, labor laws, whatever the case is. Any of those factors would shift the wage setting curve. All right? So, for example, on your labor market, you've got your wage setting relation and you've got your price setting relation. They correspond to a certain unemployment rate. Okay? If we would increase our unemployment rate using the wage setting relation, we would need to shift it to the right. So it would be an increase in bargaining power of our laborers. Okay? Any factor that would increase the bargaining power of laborers, for example, an increase in minimum wages. Okay? And the minimum wage would have to increase. All right, your price setting relation. Price setting relation is 1 over 1 plus the markup. Okay? Now, because it's 1 over 1 plus the markup, an increase in the markup of firms will actually shift the price setting relation downwards. A decrease in the markup of firms will shift it upwards because 1 over 1 plus the markup. Okay, so that's the only factor that would shift the price setting curve, markup. And in this case, if unemployment were to increase, the markup were to increase. If you look at the price setting curve, if you increase markup, we are going to shift the price setting curve downwards. If you shift the price setting curve downwards to PS1, look what happens. We move from U1 to U2. We increase unemployment with an increase in markup. Okay. All right, so on the next page, the wage setting factor. Like we said, if there's anything that increases the bargaining power of workers, we shift the wage setting curve to the right. It would look something like this. And our new point of equilibrium would be at a higher rate of unemployment. For your price setting curve, if markup had to increase, we actually shift the price setting curve downwards to PS1. We increase unemployment from U to U1. Right, last question, or last long question. Use the ADAS model to explain the impact of an expansionary monetary policy in the medium run. So they do not want the short run, they only want the medium run. In the short run, what's going to happen? Expansionary monetary policy would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, but that's where the short run stops. Then the medium run is only the aggregate supply curve. So essentially, that's what this question is asking you to show, the effect of the decrease in supply to return the economy back to the natural rate of output and income. On the expected price level, real money supply, interest rates, investment spending. Okay, indicate clearly the change in the direction of the different variables and briefly explain the reason for this change. No diagram needed. Right, so expected price level. Remember, in the long run or the medium run, we start with our labor market. So our labor market, workers would expect prices to increase, okay? Therefore, they would bargain for higher nominal wages, which are a self-fulfilling prophecy. If nominal wages increase, firms will give a higher nominal wage, but remember, prices are simply a markup on nominal wage. If nominal wage increases, prices will increase. Okay. So that is the effect on price level. The next one. The real money supply. All right, for your real money supply, you need to go back to your financial market. Pretty straightforward. If prices increase, what does that do to real money? Remember, real money is money over price, and that will therefore decrease. Why? Because if prices increase, the denominator is increasing, therefore this entire term is decreasing. The real purchasing power of your money is decreasing. The interest rate, we just go one step further. In the financial market, if prices increase, real money decreases, therefore interest rates increase. And your investment spending, even more simple in your goods market. If interest rate is increasing, investment is decreasing. That is when okay. So for your multiple choice, which of the following statements are correct regarding GDP? You have to know your definition of GDP, total value of all final goods and services produced within the borders of a country for a given year. Okay? That is your aggregate output and production. Your answer would be option 4. A, C, and E. Remember, we track real GDP as opposed to nominal GDP because an increase in nominal GDP may be attributed to just a price increase. We need to look at the change in real GDP to see if there's any real economic growth, and the change in real GDP needs to be greater than the change in population. So if real GDP increases by 10%, but the population increases by 20%, it means that, yes, the cake is bigger, but you got more people eating from the cake. Therefore, each slice of cake that you get is decreasing. Okay. Question 2, induced consumption. Remember, we deal with both autonomous and induced consumption. Induced consumption depends on income. Okay? Would be option 5. Depends positively on the level of income, negatively on taxes because that reduces your disposable income, represented as the CYD part of the consumption function. Question 3. Which of the following are correct regarding your marginal propensity to consume? Your MPC, remember, is a value between 0 and 1. It is a percentage of your income that you will spend on goods and services, and obviously the remaining percentage you will save. So with your MPC, you've got an MPS. If your MPC is equal to 0.6, it means you spend 60% of your income, and therefore you save 40% of it. Right. That is when we change, or rather when we pivot the curve. When there is a change in MPC, we pivot the curve in our goods market model. Right. Answer is number 1 for question 3. Right, question 4. Okay, this is definitely going to come up in your exam. You get given the following variables. Your autonomous consumption is 100 million. Your investment is 250. Government is 400. Taxation 100. MPC is 0.8. And your output and income at full employment is 7,350. Okay. Firstly, calculate your equilibrium level of income. To do that, all right, to calculate your equilibrium level of income, it is Y is equal to your multiplier times your autonomous variables. Okay? So firstly, what we need to do is calculate our multiplier. 1 over 1 minus C. In this case, 1 over 1 minus 0.8. 1 over 0.2. Our multiplier is 5. So we're going to substitute that in. 5 times our autonomous variables. 100 for consumption, 250 for investment, 400 for government expenditure. And then when you're dealing with tax, you need to multiply it by your MPC. So minus tax, obviously it's a negative, minus MPC, which is 0.8, multiplied by our tax, which is 100. And if you solve all of that, you get 5 times 670 and 3350. So in this case, obviously, you know it's option 4 already because there's only one of those options. But if 2 of them are 3350 and you had to carry on going, now, in order for the economy to reach the full employment level of 7350, government expenditure does not have to increase by the difference between these two because of the multiplier. So remember, when government increases its spending by whatever an amount, 100 million, in this case the multiplier will take over and the multiplier is equal to 5. It means that an injection by the government of 100 million will increase our output and income by 5 times 100, 500 million. So to calculate what the government expenditure needs to change by, it is your YF minus your current level of income, right, divided by your multiplier. Okay, so YF was 7350 minus 3350 equals 4,000 divided by your 5 for your multiplier gives you 800. All right. Question 5, based on the following diagram, assume government spending and taxes both increase by 100. All right, so when government expenditure increases by a certain amount, it has a direct impact on the economy. When taxes increase by the same amount, they have an indirect impact on the economy via the MPC. All right, so to calculate the effect of a change in government expenditure on our economy, let's first calculate the multiplier. You use the slope of the curve to calculate the multiplier. That is our MPC. Calculate your multiplier, 1 over 1 minus the MPC, in this case 0.75. Your multiplier in this case is 4. So I'm just going to substitute in two different amounts. If there is a change in government expenditure of 100, the impact on the economy will be 100 multiplied by 4, which is your multiplier. Change in Y equals 400. If there is a change in taxation of 100, yes, we multiply it by the multiplier, but we also need to multiply it by the MPC. Okay? So in this case, your change in Y would be 400 times 0.75, which would be 300. And that's exactly how the graph would look. So we would shift this up by 400, and we would shift this down by 300, and there would be a net effect of an increase in output and income. So your answer in this case would be 4. Right, question 6. Positive relationship occurs between the level of output and income and the demand for money. An increase in the level of output and income causes a rightward shift of the money demand curve. Based on the following diagram, question 7, which of the following is correct? It would be A, B, and C. Question 8, if the financial market is in a liquidity trap, it implies both B and C. Question 9, which of the following can be regarded as fully exogenous in the goods market, while exogenous and endogenous in the ISLM, investment spending? Number 10, in the ISLM model, a decrease in the budget deficit, remember, that is contractionary fiscal policy, requires an increase in tax and or a decrease in government expenditure, which would shift the IS curve to the left. Number 11, comparing the different points of those different LM curves, it is option 3. Question 12, option 1. Question 13, option 2. Option 3. 15, option 1. 16, option 3. 17, option 1. 18, option 4. 19, option 4. And question 20 is option 5.